The Shaping Opinion podcast is brought to you by O'Brien Communications, an independent corporate communications firm. O'Brien Communications helps clients of all sizes with corporate communications and strategic planning, marketing communications, public relations and media relations, content development and writing, and crisis and issues management. Learn more at o'briencommunications.com. Can you describe the earliest Christmas morning that you remember?
The earliest Christmas morning I remember would be when I was about, I would say, 7 years old, and I had asked for Davy Crockett paraphernalia. That was the Walt Disney fad of the time, and my parents obligingly came across with a fringed jacket, a fringed buckskin jacket made out of plastic, and a coonskin cap.
Do you remember what your reaction was when you saw it?
Oh, sheer delight. Yeah, it was everything that I had wanted. I think I rushed around holding a BB gun and pretending to defend the Alamo.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Gerry Bowler. He's the author of a book entitled Santa Claus, a Biography. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Gerry about all things Santa Claus, from his birth and evolution over the centuries to his role in modern-day culture. Santa Claus the philanthropist, Santa Claus the gift giver, and Santa Claus the adman. Gerry, you've written one of the more popular books on the history and evolution of Santa Claus. What is it that compelled you to write that book, and what did you want to accomplish through it?
The theory of the book was that Santa Claus has a very interesting history, and if we treat him as a genuine biographical figure, there is a real narrative arc, a life story appearing. Santa has descendants and a birth in a particular place at a particular time, and he has a career he's developed over the years and become one of the, well, I would say the most popular imaginary figure on the planet.
In your book, you detail the birth of Santa Claus, and as you mentioned, his character development. You describe him as an advocate, an adman, a warrior, and of course his role in entertainment from movies, television, to music, books, and literature. You also mention that gift-giving predated Santa Claus as a Christmas tradition. Can you start there? Can you tell us a little bit about the gift-giving tradition that predated Santa Claus?
Gift-giving at midwinter has a very long history. It goes back at least a couple thousand years to the time of the Romans, who had midwinter festivals such as the Calends of January, which was New Year's, and Saturnalia, both of which involved gift-bringing. When Christianity began about 2,000 years ago, the original nativity story has gifts brought to the baby Jesus, gifts brought by the Magi of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when Christianity becomes established as an official religion in the Roman Empire, it adopts some of the gift-giving habits of the surrounding culture. So for maybe about 11 or 1,200 years, gift-giving is part of the Christmas celebration, but it's either in the form of charity that people can demand of social superiors, or gifts up and down the society's totem pole, as it were, gifts to your superiors to sort of lubricate relationships. There are no gifts specifically given to children until about the year 1200, when it seems that some nuns in Europe began to put little treats in the shoes of the children they looked after on the eve of St. Nicholas. And this is in early December. St. Nicholas was the patron saint of children. And so for, let's say, the years 1200 to about 1550, St. Nicholas was the magical gift bringer. It was said on the night, December 5th, he would come and leave treats for good little girls and boys, and he would leave a switch or some horse manure or something unpleasant in the shoes of bad little boys and girls. He became enormously popular. There were toy fairs at Christmas to produce the toys for Christmas gift giving, St. Nicholas fairs in which, kind of like the Christmas fairs of today, there'd be merchants selling things like gingerbread and treats for the family. In the 1500s, the Protestant Reformation attacked the cult of saints, and Protestant countries began to give St. Nicholas the boot as the magical gift bringer. But they still wanted some magical figure to bring gifts to their kids in December. So they hit upon the notion of the Christ child. And the Christ child would bring gifts not so much on St. Nicholas's Eve, but on Christmas Eve. Now, the problem with the Christ child as a magical gift bringer was that it was difficult to portray a baby bringing along a big basket or a bag of presents. And a baby didn't really scare kids into good behavior the way St. Nicholas and the threat of his switches and beatings did. So European writers and parents came up with a notion of the Christ child, usually portrayed by pre-adolescent girl in a white dress, being accompanied by scary helpers, helpers with soot or ash on their face and furs. These guys, these monsters, would do the scaring, and they would do the carrying of the basket. And over time, these notions of fur-clad Christmas visitors, they're going to morph into something else. Now, one of the places where St. Nicholas endured was the Netherlands, in Holland. And when the Dutch took their colonists to North America, particularly to the Hudson River Valley and what's now New York, they brought the notion of St. Nicholas with him. And German immigrants to what's now Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, they brought with them these scary, shaggy monsters. Okay, so we've got these in the folk customs now of the northeastern colonies that become the United States. In the 1700s, Christmas had kind of fallen into a decline, and people had forgotten much that they had once enjoyed about Christmas for a variety of reasons. And so it was time, a little after the year 1800, to save Christmas. And in England, that's done by Charles Dickens and some hymn collectors. And in the United States, it's done with the morphing of St. Nicholas into Santa Claus.
You make a few points there about St. Nicholas, and I just want to give a little background on that because there is a legend as to why St. Nicholas was the selection. And based on your book, you said that St. Nicholas, who died in 333 AD or somewhere around there, had a legend. And his legend was that there was a father who was down and out, and he could not provide for his 3 daughters. So he decided to sell them into slavery. So what happened, and this is the legend of St. Nicholas, is he brings bags of gold and he sneaks them through the father's windows, saving the girls from a life of oppression. So this is that first legend of nocturnal do-gooding, as you said it. So by the Middle Ages, as you mentioned, this was sort of the image and reputation of St. Nicholas, who was a revered saint. So then going back to what you said, he had that legend, and that carried with him through the Middle Ages and on up into the 18th and 19th centuries. And now we get into, as you mentioned, the 1700s. And I think you mentioned that the earliest mention of the name Santa Claus was in 1773. Do you remember that?
Well, that's the earliest mention we have in print in an English-speaking country. The name Santa Claus derives from the Dutch Sinterklaas, or St. Nicholas. And so the folk memory of St. Nicholas endures among the Dutch families of the Hudson River Valley and New York. The English-speaking world that's developing, the world of the new United States, doesn't have much awareness of him until a New York writer named Washington Irving writes a parody history of New York, in which he includes some Dutch folk tales. And one of those is of St. Nicholas coming during December at night, riding a magic horse and wagon and distributing presents to good little girls and boys. But the name there is still St. Nicholas. And it's not until other writers and artists, poets, join Washington Irving in a kind of collaborative myth-making that we get all of the ingredients for Santa Claus coming together. And the reason this happened in New York in the early 1800s is that Christmas had become a kind of outdoor, raucous, alcohol-fueled blowout, not fit for respectable people. It was the time in which over-drinking was encouraged, midnight gangs of men roaming the streets making horrible noises, churchgoers being beaten up, immigrants and African Americans being beaten up, and these gangs were an extremely annoying menace at the end of the year in places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York. So a number of New York upper-middle-class folks collaborated on the notion of making Christmas into a domestic, indoor, child-centered celebration, something to lessen the class conflict in society and to ameliorate what had been a social problem. So we have the notion of St. Nicholas and his gift-bringing left over from the Dutch colonists. In 1810, the New York Historical Society published a brochure that showed a Catholic bishop, St. Nicholas, rewarding a good little girl and giving a bad little boy only switches to beat himself or have his parents beat him with, and a poem about how St. Nicholas brought presents. Then, in 1821, there was an anonymous poem that just changed everything. The poem was called A Children's Friend, and this is the first time that we have the word Santa Claus attached to a magical gift bringer. Santa Claus ceases, in this illustrated poem, ceases to be a Catholic bishop. He becomes a kind of secular guy in a fur outfit with the name Santa Claus helpfully written on his the fur trim on his hat. And he is, for the first time, not associated with a white horse or a wagon. He appears in a reindeer-powered sleigh and is portrayed going through the house, giving presents to the good and leaving a nasty rod to beat the bottoms of bad little children. The next year, Clement Clark Moore, an upper-middle-class New Yorker, takes the idea of a fur-clad Santa Claus in a reindeer-powered sleigh and comes up with the poem that we now know as The Night Before Christmas. What he does, though, is shrinks Santa Claus, whom he still calls St. Nicholas, to make him small enough to come down a chimney, and instead of one reindeer, gives him 8. And that just goes viral. It becomes the world's most reproduced English poem, and northeastern United States becomes hooked on the notion of a secret, fur-clad, jovial, bearded midnight gift bringer.
one thing that you wrote in your book that I found interesting, because I had never known this before, was that Moore was riding home on Christmas Eve, and in the, I guess, horse-drawn carriage that he was in, he looked over at the driver, who was Dutch, and that is the person who sort of modeled Santa Claus that he wrote about in his poem. The Dutch driver inspired him to write the poem because apparently the Dutch driver was that short, stout, jolly old fellow, and he wrote it for his own family, Moore did. He did not write it for the public, but a friend copied it and shared it with a newspaper in Troy, New York.
Well, that's certainly the story that most people believe. There are others who say that, remember, the poem was published anonymously, so Moore did not take credit for it for almost 20 years. There's a counter-narrative that says that the poem was written by a fellow named Livingston, and that it was a servant of his who released it to the public, and that credit was unduly given to Moore. But by the 1840s, Moore is taking credit for it, and it becomes just one of the great legends of all time.
Now we get into Santa Claus, the advocate, and the adman. You mentioned in your book that his popularity made him attractive to anyone with a cause, and one of the stories that I like that you pointed out was that in the 1800s there was a group called the Loyal Temperance Legion, and there was this man who lived in a prohibition palace in the North Pole. Can you describe Santa Claus the Advocate?
Santa Claus became an instant hit in the Northeast United States, and he was seized on almost at once by advertisers who realized that he could be a perfect front for selling their products, but also by all kinds of people with causes to promote. And so we have Santa Claus as an advocate of certain kinds of behavior. Some of these are in the anti-alcohol line. Some are for parents using him as a threat against their children. He becomes a symbol of patriotism in the Civil War, both for the North and the South. But as all of these narratives are being developed, we realize that there isn't a single image of Santa. For many, many years, America is undecided as to whether he is tiny, the size of a thumb, or kind of elfish size, like Clement Clark Moore thought, or that he's a full-grown man. Is he young? Is he old? Does he have a beard? What's he dressed like? And so all of these stories compete in the public mind until gradually, toward the end of the century, it becomes recognized that he is grandfatherly and portly and associated with the North, and eventually decided that it's the North Pole that he lives at.
And to this day, actually, Santa Claus the Philanthropist is part of the season. All we have to do is walk by any street corner in a major city and see that Santa Claus with a Salvation Army kettle and just have a symbol of that Santa Claus the Advocate. But Santa Claus the advertising person is really something that drove what we might call today the Christmas shopping season, because gift giving lends itself to buying things, shopping, marketing, economic advantages. So that's big business. And one of the focal points of this discussion then, when we talk about Santa Claus the adman, is his relationship with Coca-Cola. And I really like how you detailed in your book the story of Santa Claus and Coca-Cola and how they may not have had as much to do with the Santa we know today as a lot of people give them credit for.
Santa Claus is, as I say, seized upon instantly by merchants. In the 1820s, he's being used as the avatar of generosity, and a way that merchants can decommercialize what they sell. They're kind of making sacred the buying of things at Christmas. So it's also a delight to advertisers that Santa Claus has no copyright and that anybody can use him. and he is universally recognized as this symbol of generosity and beneficence. So you can use him to sell anything, from sex to weapons to motor cars to hammer sets. In the 1930s, there is just a spectacularly successful advertising campaign brought about by Coca-Cola. Coke had been in some rough times in the late 1920s. Rumors had started that Coke was, going to soften your brain, and it was, somehow something to be avoided. Coke also wanted to make its consumption a year-round phenomenon rather than occurring simply in the summertime. So they hired a Chicago artist named Haddon Sundblom to come up with splendid paintings of this lavishly fur-clad, beaming, grandfatherly figure that we now know as the Coca-Cola Santa. And a lot of people have thought that it was Haddon Sundblom and Coca-Cola who actually gave us this image. In fact, Coke was not the first soft drink company to use it, and that credit for that goes back to the mid-19-teens, when the White Rock Beverage Company of New York used the image of a red and white fur-clad Santa to promote their beverages. But the notion that red and white is associated with Coca-Cola continues until this day. It's one of those myths that's very hard to shake.
And you said that not only was Haddon a legendary illustrator of Santa Claus, but before him, the Saturday Evening Post had already turned to Norman Rockwell to do it.
Norman Rockwell and a wonderful illustrator named Leyendecker, they had helped to standardize the view of Santa Claus. Probably that view had settled about the year 1900, and it was really popularized in these mass circulation magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, so that we can't think of Santa as anything else now but that this grandfatherly figure in a red suit and white trim, a big black belt, black boots. It's a somewhat different image in Europe when he spreads, but the red and the white and the fur are constants there too.
Now, Santa Claus has sold billions of dollars worth of product, services, and merchandise. But Santa Claus has been no slouch in the entertainment world, from books and literature going back centuries to film and movies in the 20th and 21st centuries on television and in music. Can you describe Santa Claus and how he's evolved in the entertainment world?
Well, he starts off in poetry. Starts off in A Children's Friend and The Night Before Christmas. He continues in stories all through the 19th century. And in the 1890s, he starts appearing in movies. Among the very first movies are depictions of this magical creature coming down a chimney and delivering presents. Not much of a story arc, but for people to go into a darkened room and see magic on the screen was quite entrancing. By 1900, he's such a popular figure that he's used in satire, and so we have humorous stories about St. Nicholas. Somewhere along the line, he acquires a wife, and there's all kinds of humorous debates as to whether this is a happy marriage or whether he's nagged, or as women began to struggle for the vote, whether Mrs. Claus might be a secret suffragette. Now, short stories and novels continue, but the main venue for the spreading of the Santa myth becomes movies, particularly after World War II. And the question there then is how do we make use of Santa in the movies when he's such a familiar creature? So movie makers, either animators or live action directors, have to give new twists on Santa. And one of these comes out of an advertising flyer in Chicago that introduced the character of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So from now on, we have not just 8 reindeer, we have a 9th. And then as the myth becomes familiar, he appears in movies that combine an adult appeal as well as a children's appeal. And I'm thinking here of Miracle on 34th Street, which appears toward the end of the 1940s, detailing how a fellow who calls himself Kris Kringle convinces a very skeptical little girl that Santa Claus actually exists. That became a TV show. It was remade as a movie. And animation, live-action movies, every year come out. New twists on old themes continue until this day. But what's interesting is how much the original Santa endures, how immutable his image is. I could tell you of all the variations on themes as to what his North Pole might look like. Sometimes it's a domestic little elf-centered backyard workshop. Sometimes it's a huge industrial complex. Sometimes there are revolts by workers, wisecracking elves. But the image of Santa has to stay the same. He has always to be this grandfatherly figure that is going to magically appear one night a year.
One of the interesting things you just kind of alluded to was when we create brands for organizations, we come up with very clear, detailed guidelines on the brand. In other words, the colors, the fonts, the imagery, how things should be depicted, right down to the final detail. Now, you mentioned that Santa Claus doesn't even have a copyright, let alone a standardized branding guideline. Yet at the same time, through all the decades and all the different formats, there is a consistency in the way Santa Claus is depicted, and people seem to know what they have to stay true to in order to be a convincing Santa Claus. What would you say those attributes are? What is Santa Claus always going to have?
He's always going to be grandfatherly. He's going to be that non-judgmental elderly male figure, the kind of figure that children love with their own grandfathers. He's going to have a costume that is recognizable. There's a North American version and there's a European version, but that remains pretty much the same. The red and the white will always stay the same. But the essence is that he is magic, full of grace, full of forgiveness, bonhomie, and he's not the threatening figure that he would have been in the 19th century or that St. Nicholas was.
He's one of those people I know as a parent, he's one of those people your kids do not want to disappoint. That is his condign power, is if you disappoint him, you may not get what you want.
Yes, we continue to make that threat, but we very, very seldom ever carry it out. Remember, he's not a parental figure. He is a grand parental figure. And one of the astonishing things about Santa Claus is that he is overwhelmingly a product of parents. If parents don't tell their kids about it, the whole thing dies. I don't care how many millions, Sony or Coke spends on ads. If parents don't go along with it, he doesn't exist for the kids. And even more astonishing is that parents give up the right to be thanked for all of the good that Santa does. What parents are doing in giving Santa Claus to the children is giving them an enormous gift at the cost of receiving the credit themselves. So they give their children the gift of imagination, of unmerited love, and they could be getting the kudos for these gifts under the tree, but they deflect it onto this gift bringer. And it infuses December with a kind of magic that doesn't exist any other time of the year.
Based on all your research, and you look backwards centuries, you've seen the patterns and you obviously are aware of the current trends in society. What do you think about the future for Santa Claus?
I think it is a rosy one. I don't think that people's Discomfort with some of the commercial aspects of Christmas is ever going to translate into abandoning the magic of Santa Claus. I think he will coexist with the original nativity story, and centuries from now, as I say in the book, I think Santa Claus is going to be showing up on Mars and dropping down the oxygen vent and giving presents to Earth colonists there.
Gerry Bowler, thank you for joining us today.
Always a pleasure.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Gerry Bowler, and you'll find more information on his book entitled Santa Claus, a Biography. You'll also find more links and information on the story of Santa Claus. You can also listen to other episodes, and if you like the Shaping Opinion podcast, please make sure to share, rate, and review it wherever you listen to your podcasts. And don't miss our next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on your favorite podcast channel and at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.